My husband's dying wish was to protect our son. Then my greedy family showed up to take everything, and then I. The moment we heard the words stomach cancer leave the doctor's mouth, it felt like the world beneath me had cracked open, swallowing everything I knew about the life we had built together. Daniel, the man I had loved for over a decade, the father of our 10-year-old son, Lucas, was supposed to have decades ahead of him. Yet here we were, sitting in a sterile office, clutching each other's hands like we could somehow keep time from slipping through our fingers. He had always been the kind of person who could walk into a room and command attention without even trying. Someone who never backed down from a challenge. Someone who made everything seem possible. And yet, here he was, nodding solemnly while the doctor explained the treatment plan that would, at best, only buy him time. I had spent that entire appointment staring at the doctor's lips moving, hearing the words but unable to process them, my mind desperately searching for some loophole, some way to negotiate our way out of this nightmare. But no matter how hard I tried, there was no way around the brutal reality staring us in the face. The one thing that made this entire situation slightly less unbearable was the fact that Daniel had been successful enough in his career to ensure that money would never be an obstacle in his fight for survival. We had the ability to fly to specialists across the country, consult with the best oncologists, experiment with cutting-edge therapies that most people couldn't even dream of affording, and yet, despite the limitless resources at our disposal, it became clear within months that all we were really doing was delaying the inevitable. I wanted to believe that every treatment, every clinical trial, every excruciating round of chemotherapy was bringing us closer to a miracle, but deep down, I knew that hope was slipping through my fingers faster than I could grasp it. The days blurred into a cycle of hospital visits, test results, medications, and whispered conversations that I didn't want Lucas to overhear, because how do you explain to a 10-year-old that his father, the man who had been his entire world, was never going to get better? Through it all, Daniel's parents, Margaret and Thomas, became my pillars of strength, stepping in without hesitation to help in any way they could, taking Lucas to school when I was too exhausted to function, bringing meals so I wouldn't have to think about cooking, sitting with Daniel when I needed a moment to breathe, even though breathing never felt easy anymore. Margaret, with her quiet but unwavering presence, would always find a way to take something off my plate before I even had the chance to ask, while Thomas, despite his own heartbreak, did his best to keep things as normal as possible for Lucas, making sure he still had someone to help him with his math homework, still had someone to take him to baseball practice, still had someone to joke around with even when laughter felt like a foreign concept in our house. My own parents, on the other hand, might as well have lived on another planet, despite being only a short drive away, because no matter how many times I reached out, no matter how many times I made it clear that I needed them, there was always an excuse, always something more important on their schedule. My mother, Caroline, had always been the kind of person who thrived on being needed, but only when it was by my younger sister, Melissa, whose problems, no matter how trivial, always seemed to take precedence over anything happening in my life. When I asked them if they could pick Lucas up from school one afternoon because Daniel had been hit particularly hard by the latest round of chemo, I was met with an apologetic but firm, "Oh, honey, we'd love to help, but we promised Melissa we'd look at apartments with her today, and you know how she gets when she's stressed." That was the way it had always been, ever since we were kids, with me constantly pushed to the background while Melissa took center stage, and I had long since learned that expecting anything different would only lead to disappointment. At first, I told myself that maybe they just didn't know how to handle the situation, that maybe the reality of Daniel's illness was too much for them. But the more time passed, the more it became painfully clear that it wasn't that they couldn't be there for me. It was that they simply didn't want to be. It wasn't as if I was asking them for anything unreasonable. I wasn't expecting them to sit by Daniel's bedside or take on any of the heavy lifting that Margaret and Thomas had shouldered without hesitation, but the least they could have done was acknowledge that I was drowning. The least they could have done was show up, even just once, instead of treating my husband's terminal illness like an unfortunate inconvenience that they would rather not have to deal with. Lucas, despite being only 10, was perceptive enough to sense that something was wrong, even though I did my best to shield him from the full weight of what was happening. Every night when I tucked him in, he would look up at me with wide, worried eyes and ask, "Mom, when is Dad going to get better?" And every single time, I found myself struggling to come up with an answer that wouldn't shatter him. "The doctors are trying their best, sweetheart," I would whisper, brushing the hair back from his forehead, knowing that eventually, I was going to have to tell him the truth, but not knowing how to do it without breaking his heart into a million pieces. As the months passed and Daniel's condition deteriorated, I found myself running on autopilot, too numb to process anything beyond what needed to be done in the moment. I had stopped crying, not because I didn't feel the grief pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake, but because I didn't have the luxury of breaking down when there were still things that needed to be taken care of, still medications to administer, still endless appointments to keep track of, still a son who needed me to hold it together. I spent my days at the hospital and my nights lying awake in bed, listening to Daniel's breathing grow weaker with each passing day, counting down the moments until the inevitable, even though I wasn't ready to say goodbye. The night Daniel died, I was sitting beside him, holding his hand in mine, watching the rise and fall of his chest grow more and more shallow with each passing breath. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, his voice barely above a whisper as he murmured, "Take care of Lucas. You're the strongest person I know." And then, just like that, he was gone, and I sat there, frozen in place, gripping his hand even as it grew cold, unwilling to accept that the person who had been my entire world for the past 12 years had just taken his last breath. When I finally managed to pull myself together enough to reach for my phone, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely type out the words, "Daniel passed away tonight," before sending the message to my mother. It took her over an hour to respond, and when she did, it was with a simple, "That's awful," as if I had just informed her about a minor inconvenience rather than the fact that my husband was dead. There was no phone call, no offer to come over, no question about how Lucas and I were holding up, just two words that confirmed what I had already known deep down. My parents were never going to be the people I needed them to be. The hours after Daniel's death passed in a fog so thick I could barely think, barely move, barely do anything other than exist in a reality I wanted no part of. I sat in that hospital room long after the nurses had come in, long after they had quietly checked for a pulse they already knew wasn't there, long after one of them gently placed a hand on my shoulder and asked if I needed to call someone. My fingers trembled as I dialed Margaret's number, and the second she answered, I didn't even have to say the words out loud because she already knew. There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line, a small, broken sound that made my chest tighten painfully before she whispered, "We'll be there soon." True to her word, she and Thomas arrived at the hospital within the hour, their faces etched with grief so deep I could see the weight of it in their eyes. Without hesitation, Margaret wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time since Daniel had taken his last breath, I felt the warmth of something solid, something grounding, something that reminded me that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. The night felt endless as I sat in our quiet, empty house, staring at the spot on the couch where Daniel used to sit, knowing he would never be there again. Lucas had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms after crying himself into exhaustion, and I envied him in that moment, envied the way sleep had given him a temporary escape from the unbearable weight of our new reality. I hadn't even begun to process what life without Daniel was supposed to look like, hadn't even allowed myself to think beyond the next breath, the next second, the next moment that felt like too much to handle. The funeral home needed to be called, the arrangements needed to be made, the endless phone calls to friends and family needed to happen. But the thought of speaking the words, "Daniel passed away," out loud again felt like trying to swallow broken glass. The next morning, I forced myself to go through the motions of planning a funeral, even though every part of me wanted to crawl under a blanket and pretend that none of this was real. Margaret and Thomas sat with me at the kitchen table, helping me make decisions when my brain refused to function, gently steering the conversation when I got stuck on insignificant details, doing everything in their power to shoulder the burden so I wouldn't have to carry it alone. I found myself staring at a stack of sympathy cards that had already started arriving, struggling to comprehend how the world could move so quickly when my entire existence had just been shattered. My mother, unsurprisingly, had not called, had not stopped by, had not made any effort to acknowledge what had happened beyond that brief, emotionless text message. By the time I finally gathered the strength to send out a message informing everyone of the funeral details, I felt like I had been drained of every last ounce of energy I had left. I sent a short, simple text in the family group chat, detailing the time and location of the service, watching as the read receipts popped up next to my parents' and Melissa's names, waiting for even the smallest acknowledgement. An hour passed, then 2, then 3, and still, there was nothing but silence. I tried to tell myself that maybe they were processing, that maybe they would call, that maybe, just this once, they would do the right thing, but deep down, I already knew better. The day before the funeral, overwhelmed by the endless list of things that still needed to be done, I forced myself to do something I had been dreading and called my mother directly. I could hear the noise of conversation and clinking glasses in the background when she answered, and before I could even get a word out, she said, "Oh, Ella, we saw your message, but I wanted to let you know we won't be able to make it." There was a pause as if she expected me to accept that without question, but when I didn't respond, she continued, "Melissa made reservations at Bordeaux to celebrate her promotion, and the brunch starts at noon. It's been on the calendar for weeks, so we really can't reschedule." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, thought that maybe my exhaustion had finally reached the point where my brain was playing tricks on me, but when I forced myself to speak, my voice came out colder than I intended. "You're telling me that you're skipping Daniel's funeral to go to brunch?" My mother sighed, the same exasperated sigh she had used on me since I was a child whenever she thought I was being dramatic, the same sigh that had always made me feel like my emotions were an inconvenience to her. "Ella, there's no reason to make this into a fight. What's done is done, and we need to focus on the living, not the dead. Melissa's worked so hard for this promotion, and she deserves to celebrate it properly." I felt my grip on the phone tighten so hard my knuckles turned white, my nails digging into the palm of my hand as I tried to process the sheer audacity of what she had just said to me. Daniel, the man who had paid for their house repairs when their roof caved in 3 years ago, the man who had helped fund Melissa's entire college education when they couldn't afford it, the man who had been a part of their family for over a decade, wasn't even worth a few hours of their time. Before I could stop myself, I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, one that held no actual amusement, only disbelief, only anger, only the realization that any lingering hope I had about them ever changing had been completely and utterly shattered. I barely remembered hanging up the phone, barely remembered calling Melissa next, barely remembered how quickly she cut me off the second I suggested pushing the brunch back a few hours so our parents could attend the service first. "Absolutely not," she scoffed, her voice dripping with irritation. "I already sent out the invitations, and you can't just reschedule something like this. Besides, it's just a funeral, Ella. People die every day." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs in a way I hadn't expected, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had spent my entire life trying to deny. Melissa had always been selfish, always been the one who demanded attention, always been the one who expected the world to revolve around her. But I had never thought she would sink this low, never thought she would look at me, at the pain I was drowning in, and brush it aside like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, and as I stared down at my phone, my entire body shaking with anger, I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was done. I was done trying, done hoping, done expecting anything from them other than disappointment. Because no matter how much I had tried to believe otherwise, the truth was that they had never cared about me, not really, and they never would. The morning of Daniel's funeral arrived with an unbearable brightness that felt like a cruel joke, the sun shining as if the universe hadn't just stolen the most important person from my life. I had barely slept the night before, haunted by the weight of finality, The knowledge that this wasn't just another unbearable day I had to get through, but the day I would have to stand in front of a room full of people and say goodbye to the man who had been my home. The house felt suffocatingly empty without him. Every corner a reminder of the life we had built together, the life that had been ripped away from me before we ever had the chance to grow old the way we had planned. Lucas sat at the kitchen table in his too big black suit, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression carefully composed in that way only children who have had to grow up too fast can manage. Margaret and Thomas sat beside him, making quiet conversation in an attempt to keep things normal, but there was nothing normal about today, nothing normal about getting into the car knowing that we were driving toward the final chapter of Daniel's story. The chapel was already filling with people by the time we arrived, colleagues from his firm, old college friends, neighbors who had known him long before he had become the man I fell in love with. And yet, as I scanned the room, the absence of my parents was as loud as a scream. There had been no last-minute change of heart, no sudden realization that maybe they should be here for me, no sign of them anywhere, just a silence so deafening it almost drowned out the soft murmurs of conversation around me. As people came up to offer condolences, shaking my hand, hugging me tightly, telling me how much Daniel had meant to them, I found myself nodding and smiling through the pain, my grief buried beneath the necessity of performing the role expected of the widow. When the time came to stand at the podium, I forced myself to take a deep breath, gripping the edges of the wood as if holding on tightly enough would somehow keep me from collapsing under the weight of it all. My voice wavered as I spoke, but I refused to break, refused to let my grief consume me in front of a room full of people who had come to pay their respects to the man I had loved more than anything. I told stories of Daniel's kindness, of the way he had an uncanny ability to make people feel at ease, of the way he had been the type of father who never missed a single school event, no matter how busy his work schedule had been. I spoke about the way he had loved us, fiercely and unconditionally, the way he had fought so hard to stay, even when his body had been failing him, even when the pain had been unbearable. As I stepped down, my legs felt weak beneath me, but Margaret was there in an instant, wrapping an arm around my waist, steadying me without a word, giving me a quiet strength that I knew I wouldn't have had on my own. Lucas sat between them for the rest of the service, his little hands gripping both of theirs tightly, as if anchoring himself to the only family that had truly shown up for him in the moments that mattered. After the final prayer, as the guests filtered out, people stopped to tell me how beautiful the service had been, how deeply Daniel had been loved, and yet, all I could think about was the empty space in the pew where my parents should have been. More than once, someone asked about them, their absence noticeable enough that it raised questions, and each time, I found myself struggling to come up with an answer that wouldn't reveal the full extent of their selfishness. I told them they had a prior commitment, my voice clipped and emotionless, unwilling to let anyone see just how much it hurt, unwilling to let anyone know that I had been forced to grieve my husband without the people who were supposed to stand beside me. Margaret, ever perceptive, saw the way my hands trembled, saw the way I clenched my jaw each time their absence was mentioned, and before I could be asked again, she smoothly changed the subject, steering the conversation elsewhere, protecting me in a way my own mother never had. That night, after the reception had ended, after the guests had gone home, after the house was once again quiet in a way that felt unbearable, I sat on the couch staring at nothing, my body too exhausted to move, my mind too full of everything and nothing all at once. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and for a brief, foolish second, I let myself believe that maybe it was my mother reaching out. Maybe she had finally realized what she had done. Maybe there was some small part of her that regretted choosing brunch over my husband's funeral. But when I reached for the phone, my stomach twisted with something sharp and bitter as I read the message from Melissa, her words so casual, so indifferent, so completely devoid of anything resembling basic human decency that I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. Hope the funeral went okay. Mom posted pictures from the brunch. Promotion party was a huge success. Senior account executive, here I come. I stared at the message for a long time, my hands tightening around the phone until my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding so hard in my chest that it felt like I might actually be sick. There was no mention of Daniel, no acknowledgement of what I had just been through, no words of condolence. Nothing but a casual dismissal of the worst day of my life, as if it were nothing more than a minor event she had been forced to miss because she had something more important to do. The urge to reply, to unleash every ounce of the anger and disgust that had been boiling beneath the surface, was almost overwhelming, but I knew, deep down, that there was no point. I could scream, I could cry, I could tell her exactly what I thought of her, and it wouldn't change a single thing, because the truth was, Melissa had never cared, not about me, not about Daniel, not about anything that didn't directly serve her own interests. Instead of responding, I turned off my phone, tossing it onto the coffee table with more force than necessary, my hands shaking with the sheer effort of holding everything in. Margaret and Thomas had taken Lucas home with them for the night, giving me the space they knew I needed but wouldn't have asked for, and for the first time since Daniel had died, I let myself feel the full weight of my grief. I curled into the couch, pressing my face into the cushions to muffle the sound as the sobs ripped through me, my entire body shaking with the force of it, the pain so overwhelming that I thought it might actually consume me. I cried for Daniel, for the years we would never have, for the future we had planned that would never come to pass. I cried for Lucas, for the father he had lost, for the pain he was too young to fully comprehend, for the reality he had been forced to face far too soon. And, for the first time in my life, I cried for myself, for the mother who had never been a mother, for the father who had never been a father, for the sister who had never been a sister, for the family I had always wanted but never truly had. By the time the tears finally subsided, my body felt heavy, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, but as I lay there in the quiet, something inside me shifted. I wasn't sure what it was, wasn't sure if it was resolve or resignation or something else entirely, but I knew, without a doubt, that I was done trying to make people love me who had never been capable of loving me at all. The morning of the will reading arrived with the same dull, aching weight in my chest that had become my constant companion ever since Daniel's death, a heaviness that made every movement feel like I was wading through thick, unrelenting grief. I had spent the past week forcing myself to function, moving through the necessary motions of settling paperwork, making sure Lucas felt safe, reassuring Margaret and Thomas that I was managing, even though I wasn't sure if that was actually true. Every night, once the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about all the things Daniel and I would never get to do. All the plans we had made that would now exist only in the version of our lives that had been stolen from us. The lawyer, Leonard, arrived precisely at 2 in the afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase that looked as worn and exhausted as the expression on his face, a look I had seen countless times in the past few weeks from people who weren't sure how to speak to me now that I was a widow. He greeted me with the same measured tone I had come to expect from professionals who handled death regularly, his voice filled with carefully curated sympathy, the kind that never quite reached his eyes, but wasn't entirely insincere either. Margaret and Thomas arrived a few minutes later, their presence a welcome comfort in the otherwise suffocating quiet of the house, their grief still as raw as mine, but wrapped in the kind of quiet strength that had held me together more times than I could count. Lucas, ever the polite and observant child, shook Leonard's hand with a seriousness far beyond his 10 years, his small fingers gripping tightly, as if trying to prove to the world that he could be strong even when everything around him felt like it was crumbling. Leonard smiled at him, his expression softening for a brief moment before we all settled into the living room, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on all of us like an invisible force. Daniel had always been meticulous, always planned for every possible outcome, always made sure that no matter what happened, Lucas and I would never have to struggle. And yet, sitting there, waiting for Leonard to begin reading his final wishes, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread that had nothing to do with finances and everything to do with the understanding that this was another step toward accepting that he was truly gone. Just as Leonard opened the folder containing Daniel's will, the doorbell rang, the sharp chime cutting through the silence like a blade, making my entire body tense with something I couldn't quite name, but knew wasn't good. I wasn't expecting anyone else, hadn't invited anyone outside of the people Daniel had specifically named, and for a brief moment, I considered ignoring it, considered pretending that whoever it was could come back another time, because I didn't have the energy for unexpected visitors. But the second I opened the door and saw my parents and Melissa standing on my front porch, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of exaggerated sympathy, I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't about mourning Daniel at all. I didn't bother stepping aside, didn't bother pretending that I wanted them there, didn't bother hiding the exhaustion in my voice as I asked, "What are you doing here?" My mother, ever the master of playing the role of the concerned parent when it suited her, placed a hand over her chest, as if my question had wounded her in some profound way, her voice dripping with artificial warmth as she said, "We heard about the will reading and thought it would be important for us to be here. Daniel wasn't just your husband. He was family." The audacity of that statement, the sheer hypocrisy of hearing her refer to Daniel as family after skipping his funeral for brunch, was enough to make my vision blur with a combination of disbelief and rage. I had spent the past week forcing myself to push their absence from my mind, convincing myself that I didn't need them, that I didn't care, but standing there, looking at them now, all I could think about was how much I had wanted them to choose me for once, how much I had wanted them to prove me wrong. My father, as indifferent as ever, simply shrugged and said, "We have a right to be here, don't we?" As if this were some legal proceeding they were entitled to witness rather than the final wishes of the man they had treated as an afterthought. I laughed, the sound harsh and humorless, my fingers tightening around the doorknob as I leaned against the frame, blocking their entry with the full weight of my exhaustion and anger. "All right," I repeated, my voice calm in the way that only came when I was past the point of rage, past the point of even pretending to be civil. "You couldn't be bothered to show up for his funeral, couldn't be bothered to check on me or Lucas, couldn't even pretend to care that we lost him. But now you think you have a right to be here?" Melissa, ever the opportunist, folded her arms and gave me a look that I was all too familiar with, the same exasperated expression she had used on me for years whenever I called her out for her selfishness. "Oh, come on, Ella, you're being dramatic," she scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were the one acting unreasonable, as if I were the one making a scene. "You know we would have come if we could have, but some of us actually have responsibilities. Mom and Dad said the will was being read today, so obviously, we're here to support you." I didn't believe that for a second, didn't believe for a moment that they had shown up out of any real sense of duty or love or familial obligation. I had seen this pattern before, had watched it unfold in 1,000 different ways throughout my life. The way they ignored me until there was something to gain. The way they suddenly remembered I existed when there was a possibility of benefiting from my presence. Before I could respond, my mother, tired of pretending to be the grieving in-law, gave me a tight smile and said, "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. We're family, Ella. Now let us in." For a moment, I considered slamming the door in their faces, considered shutting them out the way they had shut me out every time I had ever needed them, considered telling them that whatever they thought they were going to get from this, they were sorely mistaken. But before I could make a decision, before I could act on the anger burning inside me, my father took advantage of my hesitation and stepped past me into the house, his movements casual, entitled, as if he belonged there, as if this was his space to invade. My mother and Melissa followed suit, brushing past me without so much as an acknowledgement of my shock, seating themselves on the couch across from Margaret and Thomas as if this was just another family gathering rather than a blatant intrusion. Leonard, ever the professional, simply arched an eyebrow before clearing his throat and saying, "Shall we proceed?" His voice was measured, unreadable, but I could tell from the way his gaze flickered toward my unwelcome guests that he had seen this before, that he already knew exactly how this was going to play out. I took a slow, measured breath, forcing myself to step back, forcing myself to regain control of the moment, forcing myself to remember that this wasn't just about me, that this was about honoring Daniel's wishes, about protecting Lucas, about ensuring that the people who had actually loved my husband, who had actually been there for us, were the ones who benefited from everything he had worked so hard to build. As I took my seat beside Margaret and Thomas, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my nails dug into my palms, I told myself one simple truth. Whatever my parents and Melissa were expecting from this, they weren't going to get it. Leonard barely glanced at my parents and Melissa as he adjusted his glasses and flipped open the folder in front of him. His voice measured and steady as he began reading Daniel's final wishes, his tone giving no indication of the tension that had settled over the room like a thick, suffocating fog. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, my nails digging into the skin of my palms as I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, refusing to give my parents or my sister the satisfaction of seeing just how much their presence infuriated me. Margaret and Thomas sat beside me, their expressions unreadable but their presence a silent reassurance, a reminder that, even in the midst of this chaos, I was not alone, that I had family who truly cared, that I had people who had been there when it mattered most. Leonard started with the bequests to Margaret and Thomas, explaining that Daniel had set aside $200,000 for them, a gesture of gratitude for everything they had done for us, for the love and support they had shown him throughout his life, for the way they had stepped in without hesitation when things became unbearable. Margaret gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she shook her head, her voice breaking as she whispered, "We never expected this. We never wanted anything. We just wanted to be there for him." Thomas squeezed her hand tightly, his own face lined with emotion, his voice thick with quiet grief as he murmured, "He wanted to take care of us the way we took care of him." I swallowed hard, my throat burning with the weight of everything I was holding back, my chest aching with the knowledge that Daniel had thought of everything, had made sure that even after he was gone, the people he loved would be okay, that they would never have to struggle. But before I could let myself get lost in that thought, before I could fully process the depth of his generosity, I caught the shift in my mother's expression out of the corner of my eye. The way her carefully constructed mask of sympathy faltered for the briefest of moments, revealing something cold, calculating, something I had seen countless times before but still felt like a punch to the gut. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers twisting together in a way that would have looked like grief to someone who didn't know her better, her voice laced with feigned concern as she said, "That's quite a generous amount, isn't it? It's wonderful that Daniel wanted to take care of his parents, but I assume he made sure to provide for the rest of his family as well." Melissa perked up at those words, her expression shifting from forced solemnity to barely concealed anticipation, her posture straightening as if she were preparing to receive the news she had been waiting for, the confirmation that she had been included in Daniel's financial plans. Leonard didn't react, didn't acknowledge the way my mother's voice had taken on that familiar, saccharine tone that always preceded some kind of manipulation, didn't so much as glance in her direction as he continued reading. He outlined the provisions Daniel had made for Lucas and me, the house that would remain ours, the 2 rental properties in the city that I hadn't even known Daniel had purchased years ago, the $400,000 in liquid assets that he had set aside to ensure that Lucas would never have to worry about his education, his future, his stability. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my mind struggling to grasp the extent of Daniel's planning. The way he had made absolutely certain that no matter what happened, Lucas and I would be okay, that we would never have to struggle, that his absence would not mean financial insecurity. For the briefest moment, I allowed myself to feel the relief of knowing that Daniel had thought of everything, that I wouldn't have to scramble to make ends meet, that I wouldn't have to worry about how I was going to raise our son on my own. But that relief was short-lived, because before Leonard could even finish speaking, before I could fully absorb what had just been said, my mother let out a small, pleased hum, tilting her head slightly as she said, "Well, it's nice to know that you and Lucas are well taken care of." But I couldn't help but notice that there was no mention of Melissa. I turned my head slowly, my jaw tightening as I stared at her, my heart pounding against my ribs with a mixture of disbelief and fury, my hands clenching so hard my nails bit into my skin, the pain grounding me, keeping me from saying something I might regret. Melissa, emboldened by my mother's words, crossed her arms over her chest, her lips pressing into a pout as she said, "I mean, it's not like I expected a lot. But come on, Ella, you have 2 apartments just sitting there. What do you even need both for?" My father, who had remained silent up until that point, cleared his throat, his voice taking on the same condescending tone I had spent my entire life hearing as he said, "It would only be fair to share, Ella. You have so much now, more than you could possibly need, and your sister is struggling." I exhaled slowly, my vision narrowing as I turned my full attention to them, my voice eerily calm, dangerously even, as I said, "You're seriously sitting here, in my house, days after my husband's funeral, demanding that I hand over a part of the future he worked so hard to secure for his son?" My mother scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as if I were being unreasonable, as if I were overreacting, as if I were the one being selfish instead of them. "Ella, don't be so dramatic," she chided, her voice dripping with that same false sweetness that had always made my skin crawl. "Jessica needs a stable place to live, and you have 2 perfectly good apartments that you aren't even using. It's not as if we're asking for much." Margaret, who had been silent up until that point, let out a sharp, disbelieving breath, her hands trembling with barely contained anger as she said, "How dare you sit here and speak about fairness when you couldn't even be bothered to attend your son-in-law's funeral?" Thomas, his voice quiet but firm, added, "Everything Daniel left was for his wife and child. Not for you. Not for Melissa. For Ella and Lucas. That's what he wanted." Melissa rolled her eyes, her lips twisting into a sneer as she muttered, "God, you people are so greedy. It's just 1 apartment." My patience snapped, the last thread of restraint I had been holding on to finally breaking as I stood, my entire body shaking as I said, "Get out." My mother blinked, taken aback by the steel in my voice, her mouth opening as if to argue, but I didn't let her. "You have done nothing for me, nothing for Lucas, nothing for Daniel when he was dying. And yet, you have the audacity to sit here and demand something from me." I took a step forward, my voice unwavering as I repeated, "Get out. Now." The silence that followed was thick, tense, suffocating, my parents and Melissa exchanging glances as if trying to decide whether to fight or retreat. But when I took another step forward, my mother let out a sharp, indignant huff, grabbing her purse as she said, "You're making a huge mistake." I didn't answer, didn't so much as acknowledge her words as I pointed toward the door, watching as they gathered their things and left without another word. As the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding, my entire body sagging with exhaustion, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily in my chest. Margaret reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly, her voice soft but certain as she said, "You did the right thing." And for the first time in my life, I believed it.